The Long Island Serial Killer, New York, 1996 to 2011. In one of the most disturbing and mysterious serial killer cases in recent American history, the Long Island Serial Killer, also referred to as the Gilgo Beach Killer, is believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 10 individuals, mostly sex workers, whose remains were found along the desolate stretches of Ocean Parkway in Suffolk County, New York. The gruesome discoveries began in 2010, but investigators believe that some of the murders may date back as far as 1996. For over a decade, this case baffled law enforcement and terrified the community as the killer remained at large, and the number of victims continued to rise. The case first came to light in May 2010, when 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert, a sex worker from New Jersey, vanished after visiting a client in the Oak Beach area of Long Island. As shortly after midnight, Gilbert had placed a frantic 911 call claiming someone was trying to kill her. Despite an extensive search, she remained missing for months. In December 2010, while police were searching for Gilbert's body near Gilgo Beach, they instead stumbled upon the remains of 4 other women wrapped in burlap sacks. These women were all young sex workers who had advertised services on Craigslist. Over the following months, 6 more sets of remains were discovered in the surrounding areas of Gilgo Beach and Jones Beach, bringing the total number of victims to at least 10. The media dubbed the unknown assailant the Long Island Serial Killer. The remains found shared chilling similarities. Many of the victims were petite women in their 20s, all with ties to online sex work. The manner in which the bodies were disposed, dismembered, wrapped, and scattered along the isolated coastal road, indicated a methodical and experienced killer. DNA testing helped identify several of the victims, including Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amberlynn Costello, and Maureen Brainard Barnes, who are now commonly referred to as the Gilgo Four. Other victims, however, remain unidentified to this day, known only by designations such as Jane Doe No. 6 and Baby Doe. Despite public pressure and national media coverage, the investigation yielded few tangible leads. Law enforcement agencies from local police to the FBI got involved, and various theories about the killer's identity began to circulate. Some believe the killer was a former or current law enforcement officer due to the use of burlap sacks and the precision in body disposal. Others speculated about multiple killers, given the wide time frame and differing MOs. There was also suspicion that the killer was a local resident familiar with the remote beach areas, possibly someone hiding in plain sight. Shannon Gilbert's body was eventually discovered in December 2011, a year after the search began. Her remains were located in a marsh about a mile from where she was last seen. The circumstances of her death, however, sparked controversy. The police claimed her death was accidental, citing drowning and drug use, but her family believed she was murdered by the same serial killer. An independent autopsy later suggested signs of strangulation, but the official cause of death remains undetermined. Gilbert's case continues to be linked, controversially, to the Long Island serial killer mystery. Years passed with little progress. Public frustration grew, particularly over accusations that local law enforcement mishandled evidence or delayed releasing critical information. In 2020, Suffolk County Police finally released a photograph of a belt found near one of the crime scenes, a potential clue they had kept hidden for years. They hoped it would jog the memory of someone who might recognize the item. Then, in July 2023, after more than a decade of dead ends, there was a stunning breakthrough. Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, Long Island, was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four. Investigators linked Heuermann to the crimes through a combination of cell phone records, burner phones used to contact victims, and DNA recovered from the burlap and other evidence. His arrest shocked the local community, especially because Heuermann lived in the area and had no previous serious criminal record. He was known as a quiet man, married with children, and seemingly led a normal life. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty, and investigations are ongoing to determine if he is responsible for more of the victims found along Ocean Parkway. Law enforcement continues to dig into his past, searching for links to other unsolved murders across the country. The arrest has reignited hope that justice may finally be served for the victims and their families. The Long Island serial killer case is not only a tale of gruesome murders and a decade-long mystery, but also a stark look into how society often overlooks the vulnerable. Many of the victims were sex workers, and some believe the investigation would have progressed faster had they been from different walks of life. As the legal proceedings against Rex Heuermann continue, where questions linger about whether he acted alone, how many victims there truly are, and if all those linked to the Gilgo Beach discoveries will finally be identified and given closure. The Preppy Murder, New York City, 1986. The Preppy Murder is one of the most sensational and controversial homicide cases in American true crime history. It gripped New York City and the nation in 1986, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of who the perpetrator and the victim were. The murder of 18-year-old Jennifer Levin by 19-year-old Robert Chambers revealed the darker side of privilege, media influence, and victim blaming. On the morning of August 26, 1986, the body of Jennifer Levin was discovered in Central Park, behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She had been strangled, and her body bore numerous bruises and injuries indicating a violent struggle. Jennifer, a recent high school graduate, was preparing to start college. That night, she had been seen leaving an Upper East Side bar called Dorian's Red Hand with Robert Chambers, a former student of several prestigious prep schools. Chambers initially told police he had no idea what happened to Jennifer. However, scratches on his face and hands, along with other inconsistencies, quickly made him a suspect. Under pressure, he confessed to accidentally killing Jennifer during what he claimed was rough consensual sex in the park. He alleged that Jennifer became violent, and he reacted in self-defense. This narrative would become central to his legal defense and the media frenzy that followed. The public and media soon dubbed him the Preppy Killer, a reference to his Ivy League-style upbringing and polished appearance. He was the son of a private school nurse and a video equipment executive and had a history of drug abuse and petty theft. The press latched onto the clash of images, the handsome, privileged young man versus the pretty and ambitious teenage girl, and sensationalized the case to an extreme. Chambers' defense team leaned heavily into a strategy of character assassination, painting Jennifer Levin as promiscuous and aggressive. They framed the incident as a tragic accident resulting from consensual rough sex that went too far. This tactic enraged many, especially Jennifer's friends and family, who insisted she was being misrepresented to sway public opinion and the jury. It also sparked national outrage about victim blaming, particularly in cases involving violence against women. Adding fuel to the fire, a videotape surfaced showing Robert Chambers at a party mocking the murder. In the tape, he played with a Barbie doll, simulating choking it and saying, "Oops, I think I killed it." The tape, though never shown in court, became widely known and further damaged Chambers' reputation in the public eye. Despite his defense's attempts to portray him as a victim of circumstance, many began to see him as remorseless and cruel. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution faced challenges. While they had strong circumstantial evidence, proving murder over accidental death was difficult given the lack of witnesses. After months of legal wrangling and media chaos, the jury appeared divided. Ultimately, Chambers accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and received a sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison. He served the full 15 years due to repeated infractions while incarcerated. Robert Chambers was released in 2003, but did not stay out of trouble for long. In 2008, he was arrested again, this time for drug trafficking. He was caught selling large amounts of cocaine out of his Manhattan apartment and pleaded guilty, receiving a 19-year sentence. As of today, he remains behind bars, a figure whose early notoriety followed him into a life of recurring crime. The Preppy murder case had lasting societal impacts. It became a flashpoint for discussions about media bias, the treatment of female victims in the press, and how wealth and privilege can influence public perception of criminal cases. Jennifer Levin's memory was often overshadowed by the sensational headlines about Chambers, and her family worked tirelessly to restore her dignity in the public eye. Numerous documentaries and dramatizations have since been made about the case, examining not only the crime itself, but the cultural context that allowed Robert Chambers to be painted as a tragic figure while Jennifer was vilified. The case is still cited today in discussions of legal ethics, media responsibility, and victim advocacy. Though decades have passed since that August morning in 1986, the Preppy murder remains one of the most notorious crimes in New York City history. A chilling reminder of how appearance, privilege, and perception can shape the narrative of justice. The Keddie Cabin Murders, California, 1981. Nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, the small town of Keddie was a quiet, rustic place in 1981, home to just a few dozen families. But on the morning of April 12th, the town would become the setting for one of the most gruesome and mysterious unsolved murder cases in American history. The Keddie Cabin Murders. The victims were Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother of 5, her 15-year-old son John, his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate, and her 12-year-old daughter Tina, who was initially reported missing from the crime scene. The family had moved to Cabin 28 in Keddie the year before, seeking a peaceful new start after leaving Connecticut. Sue was recently divorced and raising her children on her own in modest circumstances. On the night of April 11th, Sue, John, and Dana were at home in Cabin 28. Sue's younger sons, Rick and Greg, aged 10 and 5, along with their friend Justin, were also in the house, asleep in a separate room. According to police reports, sometime during the night, intruders entered the cabin and committed an act of savagery that left investigators horrified. The next morning, Sue's teenage daughter Sheila, who had spent the night at a neighbor's cabin, returned home to discover a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside Cabin 28, Sue, John, and Dana were found brutally murdered. Their hands and feet were bound with medical tape and electrical cords. They had been stabbed, bludgeoned, and strangled. Blood was splattered on the walls, floor, and furniture. A claw hammer and knife were later recovered from the scene, tools of the killer's trade. Strangely, the younger boys, asleep in another room, were left unharmed. Tina, however, was missing. Her disappearance added another layer of confusion and urgency to the case. Despite a massive investigation, little progress was made. Detectives from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office canvassed the area, interviewing locals and friends of the Sharp family. Several suspicious individuals emerged, including a man named Martin Smart, a neighbor and acquaintance of the family. Smart allegedly had a troubled marriage and was reportedly unhappy with Sue Sharp for offering advice to his wife. Another man, John Bobobubede, a known ex-con, was also connected to Martin and became a person of interest. A therapist would later come forward and claim that Martin Smart had confessed to the murders during a session, saying, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." This confession was not formally acted upon, and no arrests were ever made. In a disturbing twist, 3 years after the murders, Tina Sharp's skeletal remains were discovered over 80 miles away in Butte County. Her death was ruled a homicide, though the exact cause remains unknown. The case eventually went cold, but interest in the Keddie Cabin murders persisted for decades. In 2013, new DNA evidence was reportedly found on tape used to bind the victims, but it yielded no matches in criminal databases. Then, in 2016, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office announced that a hammer matching the description of one missing from the crime scene was recovered in a nearby pond, reigniting public speculation. Despite the passage of time, the brutal killings at Cabin 28 remain unsolved, haunting the small town of Keddie and raising painful questions about justice left undone. The cabin itself was demolished in 2004, but the mystery and horror of what happened within its walls still lingers. A chilling reminder that not all monsters are caught and not all stories have endings. The Boy in the Box, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1957. In February 1957, the body of a young boy was discovered in a wooded area of Fox Chase, a quiet neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia. He was found inside a large cardboard box originally used to ship a baby bassinet abandoned near a roadside. The boy appeared to be between 3 and 7 years old, naked, wrapped in a plaid blanket. His hair had been recently and crudely cut, and his body bore multiple bruises, scars, and signs of prolonged abuse. He was emaciated, suggesting long-term neglect, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. What was most shocking wasn't just the brutal nature of his death. It was that no one came forward to identify him. Despite intense media coverage, no missing child report matched his description. As days turned into weeks, the unknown child was nicknamed the Boy in the Box, and his case quickly became one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Philadelphia police immediately launched an all-out effort to solve the case. Over 400,000 flyers were distributed, plastered across the city and beyond. His photograph was displayed in post offices and utility bills nationwide. Detectives followed thousands of leads, canvassed orphanages, and scoured missing persons reports across state lines. Medical professionals were consulted in hopes that the boy's unique features, like surgical scars and his small stature, might lead to a match. Despite this, no answers came. One lead involved a nearby foster home, where a theory emerged that the boy had been the secret child of a foster family, possibly abused and discarded. However, no evidence confirmed this. Another tip suggested he was the illegitimate child of a teenage girl raised in isolation before his death, but again, there was no proof. As the years passed, the case grew colder. The boy was buried in a potter's field under a headstone reading, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." In 1998, his body was exhumed to extract DNA, which was preserved for future testing. He was reburied at Ivy Hill Cemetery, this time under a stone that simply read, "America's Unknown Child," a name reflecting the public's connection to this tragic figure. The case drew attention from amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts, some dedicating their lives to finding his identity. Over the decades, multiple people falsely confessed, including one woman who claimed her abusive mother had purchased the boy and killed him. But inconsistencies and lack of evidence discredited her story. In 2022, a major breakthrough finally came. Using advanced forensic genealogy, a process where DNA is matched with relatives via public genealogy databases, investigators traced the boy's lineage. After extensive research, they identified the child as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953, in Philadelphia. He had been just 4 years old at the time of his death. Joseph was part of a large family, but due to family circumstances and secrecy, he was never reported missing. His parents, both deceased, had never come forward. While the identification brought closure to one part of the mystery, many questions remain. Authorities believe someone alive today knows what happened to Joseph, and the search for answers continues. No one has yet been charged in connection with his death. The Boy in the Box case stands as a symbol of resilience, both in the persistence of law enforcement and the power of modern science. For over 65 years, Joseph Zarelli was nameless, faceless, a victim of silence. Now, his name is known, and his memory lives on. The case reminds us of the countless voiceless victims in society and the hope that no matter how much time has passed, justice can still be found. The Servant Girl Annihilator, Austin, Texas, 1884 to 1885. In the heart of Texas during the late 19th century, a brutal and mysterious killer cast a long shadow over the city of Austin. Between December 1884 and December 1885, a string of savage murders plagued the city, targeting primarily African-American servant women and eventually 2 white women in their homes. This unknown predator, dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator by the press, committed one of the earliest known serial murder sprees in American history. And to this day, the identity of the killer remains unknown. The first murder occurred on the night of December 30th, 1884. Molly Smith, a young African-American cook, was found in the backyard of her employer's residence. She had been dragged outside during the night, bludgeoned with an axe, and gruesomely mutilated. Her wounds shocked local authorities and set off alarm bells across the community. Just months later, in May 1885, the killer struck again. Eliza Shelley, another domestic servant, was attacked in her sleep and suffered a similarly violent fate. Her 3 children, asleep in the same room, were spared. The murders continued through the hot Texas summer. Irene Cross was the next victim, and unlike the others, she was not killed with an axe, but was nearly scalped, her body slashed with what some believed to be a sharp razor. This variation in method led some to speculate whether more than one killer was responsible. But the core elements remained consistent: late-night attacks, brutal violence, and an escape without a trace. By August, 1885, panic had fully gripped Austin. Residents began arming themselves, setting up night watches, and placing bars on windows and doors. Servants, especially black women, were terrified to sleep alone. Wealthier families demanded extra protection for their staff, while the police force, overwhelmed and under-equipped, struggled to keep up with the killer's elusive tactics. The pattern of violence escalated. In September, Rebecca Ramey and her 11-year-old daughter Mary were attacked. Mary was killed, her head nearly severed from her body, while Rebecca survived, badly wounded. This attack raised even more questions. Was the killer becoming bolder or more desperate? On Christmas Eve, 1885, for the Annihilator committed his most audacious crimes. Two white women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, were murdered within hours of each other. Susan was found in her backyard, her head split open, her body mutilated. Eula was killed in a similar fashion, dragged from her bed while her husband slept nearby. Her body was discovered in a nearby alley, battered and lifeless. The back-to-back murders of two white women on the same night caused public hysteria. While the deaths of black servant women had sparked fear, the murder of prominent white women brought an unprecedented level of urgency to the case. City leaders demanded swift justice, and multiple suspects were arrested in the following days, including Eula Phillips' husband, James Phillips. He was convicted of her murder, but was later released due to lack of evidence. No one else was ever successfully charged. Despite the widespread manhunt, the killer vanished. The murders suddenly stopped after that Christmas Eve in 1885, leaving residents on edge, but with no closure. The fear lingered long after the bloodshed ended. The case inspired endless rumors. Some believed the killer had died or been institutionalized. Others suggested he had fled town or even moved overseas. One popular theory, still debated today, is that the servant girl annihilator went on to become Jack the Ripper in London, whose killing spree began in 1888. Though intriguing, this theory lacks hard evidence. What made these crimes particularly horrifying was not just the brutality, but the era. In the 1880s, Austin was a growing city, but its police force lacked the tools of modern forensics. There were no fingerprints, DNA analysis, or surveillance. Investigations relied on eyewitness accounts and basic interrogation, often skewed by racial bias and fear. The killer exploited these limitations, moving through the night like a ghost, and left behind a trail of blood that no one could follow. In recent years, historians have revisited the case, combing through old records and news articles in search of answers. Despite their efforts, the identity of the servant girl annihilator remains one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. Today, the story lives on in Austin's folklore. The sites of the murders are now part of the bustling downtown area, and some locals claim the victims still haunt the city streets. The servant girl annihilator's reign of terror left a permanent mark on Austin, not just in terms of history, but in how we understand the evolution of criminal investigations, meaning it exposed the vulnerabilities of a growing urban population and revealed how fear could alter the very rhythm of daily life. Though time has buried the Annihilator's identity, his legacy remains, a specter of terror from a time long past whose name still sends chills through those who remember the dark year of 1885. The Cleveland Torso Murders, Cleveland, Ohio, 1934 to 1938. Between 1934 and 1938, Cleveland, Ohio, was terrorized by one of the most brutal and perplexing serial killers in American history. Known by many names, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, the Cleveland Torso Murderer, or simply the Butcher, this unidentified killer was responsible for at least 12 confirmed murders, though some estimates place the number closer to 20. The gruesome nature of the crimes, coupled with the inability to identify the perpetrator, made this case one of the most haunting cold cases of the 20th century. The victims, most of whom remain unidentified to this day, shared a few key traits. They were typically drifters, transients, or sex workers, often from marginalized communities that frequented Kingsbury Run, a shanty town in the industrial heart of Cleveland. The killer's signature was brutal and specific. Each victim was decapitated, and many were dismembered. In several cases, the heads were never recovered, making identification impossible. Some victims also showed signs of chemical treatment to delay decomposition, suggesting a killer who had some understanding of human anatomy and decomposition processes. The first official victim was discovered in September 1934. A young man found the torso of a woman wrapped in burlap near Lake Erie. The remains showed precise cuts and the head was missing. A year later, in September 1935, the second and third victims were found within days of each other in Kingsbury Run. Both were male, decapitated, and their bodies bore evidence of surgical-like precision. As the murders continued, so did the fear in Cleveland. In early 1936, another woman's torso was found near the same area. Her head was later discovered buried in a tin can nearby. Authorities attempted to identify her through fingerprinting, but with limited success. By 1937, the total number of victims had climbed, and public panic surged. The killer's ability to evade capture despite leaving bodies in public places baffled investigators. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was how the murderer seemed to taunt law enforcement, always staying one step ahead. Many victims were found within sight of police patrol routes, and in some cases, parts of the body were placed deliberately in open areas, as if to ensure discovery. The case reached national attention when Eliot Ness, the famed prohibition agent who helped take down Al Capone, was brought in as Cleveland's public safety director. Ness launched a massive crackdown on Kingsbury Run, raiding and destroying the shantytown in hopes of flushing out the killer or at least reducing his hunting ground. Hundreds of people were detained, questioned, and forced out of the area, but the murders continued. In 1938, a particularly brazen act stunned even seasoned investigators. 2 victims were discovered on the same day, one of them dumped within view of Ness's own office window. Frustrated and under pressure, Ness took the controversial step of arresting a suspect named Frank Dolezal, a transient who had known one of the victims. Dolezal confessed under dubious circumstances but later recanted, claiming police brutality. Before he could be properly tried, he was found dead in his jail cell under suspicious conditions. Though Dolezal's death was officially ruled a suicide, many believe the police had used him as a scapegoat to placate public demand for justice. The case soon went cold, and no one was ever charged. Over the years, several theories emerged about the killer's identity. One of the most prominent suspects was Dr. Francis Sweeney, a World War I veteran and surgeon with mental health issues. He was interviewed extensively by Ness and even failed a polygraph test, but Ness lacked hard evidence to bring charges. After being committed to a mental institution, Sweeney allegedly sent taunting postcards to Ness for years, further fueling suspicion. Another theory suggested that the torso murders were the work of multiple killers, given the variations in dismemberment style and victim profile. However, most experts agree the killer had some level of medical or anatomical training based on the precision of the mutilations. Despite the passage of nearly a century, none of the victims have been conclusively identified, and the killer's identity remains a mystery. The Kingsbury Run area has long since been redeveloped, but the legend of the Mad Butcher persists. It has inspired books, documentaries, and even fiction, serving as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable society can be to an intelligent and elusive predator. The Cleveland torso murders remain one of America's oldest and most terrifying unsolved serial murder cases. A killer who struck without mercy, targeted society's most vulnerable, and vanished without a trace, leaving behind only fear, mutilated bodies, and a haunting legacy that endures to this day. The Tylenol Murders, Chicago, Illinois, 1982. In the fall of 1982, Chicago was the site of one of the most terrifying and mysterious mass murder cases in U.S. history, a case that would forever alter how consumers purchase and trust over-the-counter medications. It was called the Tylenol Murders, and it began as a normal September day with people across the city taking medication for everyday aches and pains, unaware that for some, it would be their last act. On the morning of September 29th, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman from Elk Grove Village woke up with a sore throat and runny nose. Her parents, like many others, turned to extra-strength Tylenol. Mary took 1 capsule before heading back to bed. A short time later, she collapsed in the bathroom. Despite efforts by paramedics, she died suddenly and inexplicably at the hospital. Her death stunned her family and baffled doctors. Just hours later, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janus of Arlington Heights felt ill and took Tylenol for chest pains. He too collapsed and died shortly after arriving at the hospital. His death was attributed to a heart attack, until tragedy struck again. As Adam's family gathered to mourn his death, his younger brother Stanley Janus took Tylenol from the same bottle. Moments later, he also collapsed. Stanley's wife, Teresa, took 2 capsules to cope with the emotional toll. She too fell unconscious. Both were dead within hours. The series of sudden deaths shocked local authorities. While hospitals scrambled to understand what had killed these seemingly healthy individuals, Cook County's chief medical examiner made a chilling discovery. Blood tests revealed that all 3 Janus family members had died of cyanide poisoning. This revelation triggered a public health emergency. Investigators raced to find the common link and quickly discovered that each of the victims had taken extra-strength Tylenol capsules shortly before their deaths. Law enforcement, now realizing the gravity of the situation, sent urgent alerts to the public. Shelves were cleared of Tylenol, and police drove through various neighborhoods using bullhorns to warn people not to take the medication. Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol's manufacturer, issued a nationwide recall of over 31 million bottles, an unprecedented move at the time. The recall cost the company more than $100 million, but it was a crucial step in protecting public safety and salvaging consumer trust. In total, 7 people died as a result of taking cyanide-laced Tylenol in the Chicago area. The deaths were random and appear to have no personal connection, pointing to a chilling conclusion: someone had tampered with the medication on store shelves. The poison capsules were traced back to multiple retail locations, suggesting that the killer, or killers, had removed the bottles, injected cyanide into the capsules, resealed them, and returned them to stores. A massive investigation was launched involving the FBI, FDA, and local police. One of the primary suspects was James W. Lewis, who sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the poisonings. Lewis was arrested and convicted, not for the murders, but for extortion. Despite years of investigation, no one was ever charged with the murders themselves, and Lewis maintained his innocence in the killings. The Tylenol murders prompted sweeping changes in how products are packaged. Tamper-evident seals, blister packs, and new federal laws about product tampering were introduced as a direct result of the crisis. The incident also led to the creation of the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, making tampering with consumer products a federal offense punishable by life imprisonment. Johnson & Johnson's handling of the crisis became a textbook case of crisis management. Their immediate recall, open communication with the public, and introduction of tamper-proof packaging helped restore faith in the company. Within a year, Tylenol regained much of its lost market share, a remarkable recovery after a crisis that could have destroyed the brand. To this day, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. The identity of the person responsible and their motive are still unknown. The random nature of the deaths, combined with the lack of physical evidence, has made it one of the most baffling unsolved mass murders in American history. The fear and paranoia it caused are still remembered, and the incident remains a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities in everyday life, and how quickly trust can be shattered by an invisible hand. The disappearance of Eaton Pat's, New York City, 1979. On May the 25th, 1979, 6-year-old Eaton Pat's vanished without a trace from a busy Manhattan neighborhood, sparking one of the most infamous missing child cases in American history. His disappearance not only shook the city of New York to its core, but it also led to sweeping national changes in how authorities handle child abduction cases. Eaton's story remains one of loss, heartbreak, and decades of unanswered questions, only partially resolved after more than 30 years. Eaton lived with his parents and siblings in Soho, a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. He was a bright, independent boy with blonde hair and a gap-toothed smile, known to his neighbors and friends. On that fateful spring morning, Eaton was excited. His school bus stop was just 2 blocks away, and for the first time, his parents allowed him to walk there alone. He never made it. When Eaton didn't return home from school that afternoon, his mother, Julie Patz, began to worry. She contacted the school, only to find out that Eaton had never arrived. Panic set in. Police were called, and a search began immediately. Flyers with Eaton's photo were posted across the city. His face was splashed across newspapers and television screens. Over 100 police officers, along with neighbors and volunteers, searched every building, alleyway, and basement in the area, but no trace of Eitan was found. Eitan's disappearance was the first time many Americans heard the term missing child in such a personal and haunting context. His case changed the way missing children were treated in the media and by law enforcement. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th National Missing Children's Day in Eitan's honor. His photograph became one of the first to appear on milk cartons, a practice that would become common in the 1980s to raise awareness about missing kids. For years, Eitan's case remained cold. His parents, especially his father Stanley Patz, never stopped searching for answers. The focus of the investigation eventually turned to a man named Jose Ramos, a known child molester who had once dated a woman hired by the Patz family to walk Eitan home from school. Ramos was never charged in Eitan's disappearance, but in 2004, a judge declared him civilly liable for the boy's death. Despite this, there was no physical evidence linking Ramos to the crime, and Eitan's body was never found. The case remained unsolved for decades until 2012, when police reopened the investigation with renewed intensity. A new suspect emerged, Pedro Hernandez, a former stock clerk at a nearby convenience store. He had allegedly confessed to a prayer group in New Jersey in the 1980s that he had killed a child in New York. Police questioned Hernandez, who provided a taped confession claiming he had lured Eitan into the store's basement and strangled him before placing the body in a box and leaving it in an alley. The confession was controversial. Hernandez had no prior criminal record and was known to suffer from mental illness. His defense argued that the confession was coerced and unreliable. The first trial in 2015 ended in a hung jury. A retrial in 2017 resulted in Hernandez's conviction for murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Eitan's body was never recovered, and doubts linger about whether Hernandez was truly the killer. Still, for Eitan's family, the conviction brought a degree of closure after nearly 38 years of uncertainty. The disappearance of Eitan Patz left an indelible mark on American society. It led to the formation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and forever changed how missing child cases are handled, investigated, and remembered. Though his life was tragically short, Eitan's legacy continues to influence child protection laws and awareness campaigns, ensuring that his story and the search for justice will never be forgotten. The Hinterkaifeck Murders, Bavaria, Germany, 1922. In the spring of 1922, on a remote farmstead in Bavaria, Germany, known as Hinterkaifeck, one of the most chilling and mysterious unsolved murders in European history took place. On March 31st, 6 people, an entire family and their maid, were brutally murdered with a pickaxe in a sequence of events that continues to puzzle investigators and amateur sleuths over a century later. But the victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and their newly hired maid, Maria Baumgartner. The farm was located in a rural, isolated area surrounded by forests and fields. It was a peaceful, tight-knit region where everyone knew one another, which made the horror that unfolded all the more disturbing. A few days before the murders, Andreas Gruber told neighbors about strange occurrences around the farm. He reported seeing footprints in the snow leading from the woods toward the house, but not away from it. There were also sounds in the attic, but no one was found when he checked. Andreas also discovered that his house keys had gone missing. Adding to the unease, the previous maid had recently quit, claiming the house was haunted and that she constantly felt a presence watching her. On the evening of March 31st, the killer struck. It's believed the perpetrator first lured family members into the barn one by one, where they were bludgeoned to death with a mattock, a type of pickaxe. After murdering Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the young girl Keslia in the barn, the killer entered the home and murdered Joseph in his crib and Maria in her bed. What's even more unsettling is what happened after the murders. The bodies were discovered 4 days later, on April 4th, after neighbors noticed that the family hadn't been seen in days and mail was piling up. When the police arrived, they found the bodies in the barn, carefully stacked and covered with hay. Inside the house, they found Joseph and Maria's bodies. Despite the brutal murders, it appeared the killer had stayed at the farm for days afterward. Food had been eaten from the kitchen, the fireplace showed recent use, and animals had been cared for. Smoke had been seen coming from the chimney during the weekend, and people reported seeing the family's dog tied up in the barn. This behavior led to speculation that the killer remained at the farm, living among the dead. An autopsy performed on-site by Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller revealed chilling details. The victims suffered massive head trauma, with signs of strangulation in some cases. Young Kazilia appeared to have survived her initial injuries and had torn out clumps of her hair before dying, suggesting she lay alive among the bodies for some time. The investigation faced numerous challenges. Hundreds of people were interviewed, and several suspects emerged, including disgruntled neighbors, escaped mental patients, and even Victoria's rumored lover, but no concrete evidence ever surfaced. Victoria was said to have had an incestuous relationship with her father, Andreas, and rumors swirled about the paternity of her son, Josef. One theory suggested that Josef's biological father might have had a motive for the killings, but this was never confirmed. The murders remained unsolved, and over time, the case grew cold. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was eventually demolished in 1923, and a small shrine was erected on the site in memory of the victims. Decades later, the case still draws attention from criminal historians and enthusiasts. In 2007, students at the German Police Academy re-examined the evidence and reportedly identified a prime suspect. However, out of respect for the suspect's surviving relatives, the name was never made public. The official stance remains that no one has ever been charged or definitively linked to the murders. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most enduring mysteries, marked by eerie circumstances, inexplicable behavior, and a disturbing sense that the killer may have lived among the corpses, undetected, in a place that was once a family's home. The Springfield 3, Springfield, Missouri, 1992. On June 7, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri, a seemingly normal morning turned into one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history. 3 women, 47-year-old Cheryl Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Susie Streeter, and Susie's friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall, vanished without a trace from their home. More than 30 years later, the case of the Springfield 3 remains unsolved, with no evidence, no arrests, and no known suspects. The events began the night before. Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall had just graduated from Kickapoo High School and attended several parties to celebrate. Their original plan was to stay the night at a friend's house, but that plan changed late into the night, and instead they decided to go back to Susie's home at 1717 East Delmar Street, where Cheryl was already asleep. That decision would mark the last time anyone saw them. The next morning, June 7th, friends of the girls tried to contact them but couldn't get through. When they arrived at the house, they found something incredibly strange. All 3 women's cars were parked outside. Their personal belongings, purses, keys, and clothes were inside. The TV was on, the beds looked like they had been slept in, and Cheryl's cigarette, something she reportedly never went without, was left behind unsmoked. Adding to the strangeness, there was a broken porch light, and one of the glass globe covers had shattered on the front steps. Friends, not sensing the severity of the situation at first, cleaned up the broken glass, potentially destroying valuable evidence. Several visitors had entered the home throughout the morning and afternoon before police were finally called, which likely compromised the crime scene further. One eerie detail stands out. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. It was as if the 3 women simply vanished into thin air. The only disturbing clue was a message left on the answering machine. A male caller had left a strange and possibly threatening voicemail, but it was accidentally erased before investigators could analyze it. Police launched an extensive investigation. Helicopters scoured the surrounding areas, ponds and fields were searched, and hundreds of interviews were conducted. The case captivated the small community, with locals volunteering to help in search efforts. Flyers were distributed nationwide. Despite these efforts, no solid leads emerged. A few theories developed over time. One theory is that the women were abducted by someone they knew, someone they let into the house willingly. Given the lack of forced entry, this seemed plausible. while another theory involved a man named Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and suspect in other cases. He claimed to know what happened to the women and even stated that they were dead, but he has never provided concrete information, and authorities have been unable to link him definitively to the case. In 1997, investigators searched a parking garage in Springfield after receiving tips that the women's bodies might be buried beneath it. Ground-penetrating radar did reveal anomalies beneath the surface, consistent with disturbed soil or potentially even human remains. However, the cost and logistics of digging up the garage without stronger evidence prevented any excavation. Susie Streeter and her mother, Cheryl Levitt, were both described as private but friendly. Cheryl worked as a cosmetologist, while Susie was a recent high school graduate with plans to attend beauty school. Stacy McCall was known for her outgoing personality and aspirations to become a teacher, and their disappearances sent shockwaves through the community and devastated their families. To this day, the house at 1717 East Delmar has become a symbol of tragedy and unanswered questions. The case remains open, and law enforcement continues to receive tips, but none have led to a resolution. Over the years, anniversaries have brought renewed attention, documentaries have covered the case, and armchair detectives have offered countless theories. But the mystery of the Springfield Three endures. Them's up for the families. The pain of not knowing what happened remains unbearable. There is no closure, no final chapter, only an empty house, 3 missing women, and a lingering question. How could 3 people vanish without a trace? The Yuba County 5, California, 1978. In February 1978, 5 men from Yuba City, California, disappeared under bizarre circumstances in what has become one of the most unsettling unsolved mysteries in U.S. history. The case, now known as the Yuba County 5, was filled with strange clues, chilling discoveries, and more questions than answers. The men, Gary Mathias, age 25, Jack Madruga, 30, Bill Sterling, 29, Ted Wire, 32, and Jack Hewitt, 24, were close friends, all of whom had mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions. Despite their challenges, they lived relatively independent lives and shared a love for basketball. On February 24th, 1978, they traveled together to watch a college basketball game at California State University, Chico. They left the game around 10 p.m. and never returned home. The next day, the families reported them missing. Authorities immediately began searching the route between Chico and Yuba City. The first major clue came a few days later when Madruga's car, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, was discovered abandoned on a remote mountain road in Plumas National Forest, 70 miles from Chico and far off their expected route. Strangely, the car was in good condition with plenty of gas. The keys were missing, but the car wasn't stuck. It appeared the men had simply walked away. This discovery only deepened the mystery. The men had no reason to be in that area. It was a mountainous, snow-covered region, far from any towns. None of the men were dressed for the cold. Their families insisted they wouldn't have willingly ventured into such an unfamiliar and dangerous place. Months passed with no new leads until the snow began to melt in June. That's when searchers made a horrifying discovery. In an abandoned U.S. Forest Service trailer 20 miles from where the car was found, they found the body of Ted Wire. He was wrapped in sheets on a bed, and evidence suggested he had survived for weeks. His beard had grown, he had lost significant weight, and there was ample food and heating materials in the trailer. But they had not been used. Even more disturbing, a locker nearby contained matches, canned food, and enough supplies to survive. Yet Wire appeared to have slowly starved or frozen to death. Soon after, the bodies of Madruga and Sterling were found 11 miles from the car, their remains scattered and partially consumed by animals. Days later, Jack Hewitt's bones were found 2 miles from the trailer. Gary Mathias, the only one with a known psychiatric diagnosis, schizophrenia, was never found. His shoes were in the trailer, and investigators believe he may have ventured out for help but vanished. The question that has haunted this case is why. Why did 5 men on their way home from a basketball game veer so far off course? What caused them to abandon a working car, trek miles into the freezing wilderness, and fail to use the supplies that could have saved their lives? Several theories have emerged over the years. One possibility is that they became lost or disoriented. Some suggest Gary Mathias, who was known to experience psychotic episodes when off his medication, may have convinced the others to go off the main road. But friends and family dispute this, saying he was well-managed and unlikely to endanger his friends. Another theory involves foul play. The day before their disappearance, a man named Joseph Shones claimed he had driven into the same area and gotten his car stuck in the snow. He said that around midnight, he saw a group of men and possibly a woman with a baby walking in the area. He tried to call for help but couldn't. He later said he saw flashlights moving around the vehicles, but no one responded to his cries. Shones' account, though unverifiable, raised suspicions that the men may have encountered someone who led them into the wilderness. Others suggest they were running from something or someone, but no evidence of foul play was ever found. The most perplexing aspect remains the trailer. The men had found shelter, they had food, they had warmth, yet it seemed they didn't take the most basic steps to survive. Why didn't they eat the canned food? Why didn't they light a fire? Why didn't Wire break a window to open the locker? The answers remain elusive. Gary Mathias' disappearance adds another layer of mystery. Despite extensive searches, no trace of him has ever been found. Some believe he succumbed to the elements, others speculate he may still be alive, living off the grid, or even that he met a different fate entirely. To this day, the case of the Yuba County Five remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. It's a story of friendship, tragedy, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets. The Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C., 1971 to 1972. The Freeway Phantom was an unidentified serial killer who haunted the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in the early 1970s. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 African-American girls aged between 10 and 18 were abducted, assaulted, and murdered. Their bodies were discarded along the highways and roads around D.C., earning the unknown killer the nickname the Freeway Phantom. Despite a prolonged investigation involving local and federal law enforcement, the killer was never caught, and the case remains one of the region's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. The first known victim was 13-year-old Carol Spinks. On April the 25th, 1971, she left her southeast D.C. apartment to buy groceries from a nearby 7-Eleven. She never made it back home. 6 days later, her body was discovered along Interstate 295. Carol had been assaulted and strangled. Her shoes were missing and there were no immediate leads. Police were baffled, but suspected she had been abducted shortly after leaving the store. 2 months later, on July 8, 1971, 16-year-old Darlinia Johnson disappeared while on her way to work. Her body was found 11 days later near the same stretch of road where Carol Spinks was found. The remains were badly decomposed, but investigators noted enough similarities between the cases to consider the possibility of a serial offender. Once again, there were no witnesses and no suspects. In July of the same year, 10-year-old Brenda Crockett vanished after being sent to the store by her mother. This case took a chilling turn when Brenda called her home twice during her disappearance. On the first call, she told her younger sister that a white man had kidnapped her, taken her to Virginia, and would return her home soon. She seemed coached or coerced, as though someone was feeding her lines. During the second call, Brenda repeated the same information, but sounded more distressed. Hours later, her body was found on U.S. Route 50. She had been assaulted, strangled, and her feet were bare. The calls to her home marked a disturbing escalation. The killer was toying with the family and law enforcement. The fourth victim was 12-year-old Nanumoshia Yates, who disappeared in October 1971 while walking home. Her body was found within hours, discarded near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Like the others, she had been strangled and her shoes were missing. The rapid disposal of her body indicated the killer was growing more brazen and possibly more desperate. The fifth victim, Brenda Woodard, was an 18-year-old high school senior. She disappeared after having dinner with a friend. Her body was found near Route 202 just 6 hours later. A note was found in her coat pocket, and its contents shocked investigators. The note, written in Brenda's handwriting, read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." It was believed the killer forced her to write the note under duress. The taunting message confirmed that the same individual was responsible for the previous murders and was now actively mocking law enforcement. The sixth and final known victim was 17-year-old Diane Williams, who vanished on September 5th, 1972. She was last seen leaving her boyfriend's home. Her body was discovered hours later along Interstate 295. Like the others, she'd been strangled, but in a slight deviation, no sexual assault was reported. Once again, her shoes were missing, reinforcing a possible ritual or trophy-taking behavior by the killer. The Washington, D.C. community was paralyzed with fear. Parents refused to let their children leave home alone, and schools issued warnings. Despite hundreds of interviews, composite sketches, and roadblocks, investigators couldn't make progress. The FBI joined the case, and several suspects were considered, including a group known as the Green Vega Gang, who were implicated in several abductions. However, nothing tied them conclusively to the murders. Another suspect was a local police officer, but he was cleared due to lack of evidence. The killer's meticulous nature, ability to evade detection, and the disturbing letter suggested a person who was intelligent, organized, and had knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Some believed the killer might have been in a position of authority, possibly a taxi driver, security guard, or someone familiar with the local roadways. The note left in Brenda Woodard's pocket indicated a need for control and a desire to instill fear, possibly suggesting psychopathic tendencies. The murder stopped after Diane Williams, and no further cases have been definitively linked to the Freeway Phantom. Over the years, advancements in forensic technology have prompted cold case reviews, but no DNA evidence has led to a breakthrough. The case remains open, and investigators have not given up hope that one day the killer will be identified. The Freeway Phantom is one of the most chilling examples of a serial killer who targeted vulnerable victims in a tightly knit community and vanished without a trace. The loss of 6 young girls left lasting wounds in Washington, D.C. And the case serves as a grim reminder of how some killers can operate in the shadows, evading justice for decades. The Alphabet Killer, Rochester, New York, 1971 to 1973. The Alphabet Killer was an unidentified serial killer who terrorized Rochester, New York in the early 1970s. The name Alphabet Killer was coined because of a disturbing pattern found among the known victims. Each had first and last names starting with the same letter, and each was found in a town that began with the same letter as well. The murders remain unsolved to this day, and the mystery surrounding the case has gripped true crime enthusiasts for decades. The first known victim was Carmen Cullen, an 11-year-old girl who disappeared on November 16, 1971. Carmen lived in Rochester and was last seen leaving a local pharmacy. She had been sent to pick up a prescription, but never returned home. Her body was discovered 2 days later in Churchville, a small town west of Rochester. She had been assaulted and strangled. The case shocked the community, but despite a large-scale investigation involving state police and the FBI, no suspects were arrested at the time. The case went cold. Less than 2 years later, on April 2, 1973, 10-year-old Wanda Wakowicz disappeared while walking home from a grocery store. Wanda, also from Rochester, was a shy and soft-spoken girl who kept to herself. Her disappearance prompted a frantic search, and her body was found the next day in Webster, a suburb east of Rochester. Just like Carmen, Wanda had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The similarities between the two cases were immediately noted. Both girls had matching initials, Carmen Cullen, Wanda Wakowicz, and both were discovered in towns with names beginning with the same letter as their names. Additionally, they had both vanished while running simple errands. The third and final known victim was Michelle Maenza, an 11-year-old girl who vanished on November 26, 1973, while walking home from school. Her body was found 2 days later in Macedon, another town not far from Rochester. Michelle had also been assaulted and strangled. Once again, her initials matched the town she was found in. Michelle Maenza in Macedon. The pattern was too distinct to ignore, and authorities were now convinced they were dealing with a serial killer. The media dubbed the perpetrator the Alphabet Killer, and panic swept through Rochester. Parents kept their children indoors, and police urged the public to report any suspicious behavior. Despite a massive investigation and countless interviews, no arrests were made. Several suspects were considered over the years. One was Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, who had a criminal record and fled to Puerto Rico shortly after her murder. However, there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and he later died in a car accident. Another suspect, Kenneth Bianchi, known as one of the Hillside Stranglers, became a person of interest after his arrest in California for multiple murders. Bianchi had lived in Rochester during the time of the Alphabet murders, but police could not definitively link him to the crimes, and he denied involvement. Investigators believed the killer was familiar with the Rochester area, as the dump sites suggested knowledge of less traveled roads and remote locations. There was also speculation that the killer may have had access to a vehicle and perhaps posed as someone trustworthy, like a police officer or authority figure, to lure the girls. Unfortunately, forensic science in the early 1970s was limited. DNA testing was decades away, and much of the evidence collected could not be properly analyzed. Over time, the leads dried up and the cases grew cold. In recent years, advances in forensic technology prompted authorities to re-examine the evidence, including clothing and biological samples. DNA testing was conducted on several items, but no conclusive matches have been made. The possibility remains that the killer may have died or relocated, taking their secrets with them. The Alphabet killer remains one of Rochester's most disturbing unsolved cases, and the loss of 3 young girls continues to haunt the community. The eerie pattern of the victims' initials and dump site names has fueled numerous theories. Some believe the matching letters were intentional, suggesting a killer who was methodical and perhaps obsessed with patterns or rituals. Others speculate it could be a grim coincidence, and the killer may have simply chosen victims of opportunity within his own community. Regardless of the motive, the killer's identity remains unknown. To this day, the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle have received no closure. Every few years, tips resurface and the cases briefly return to the spotlight, but so far, no arrests have been made. The Alphabet killer serves as a chilling reminder of how some predators can elude justice, and how even small towns can be rocked by terror. The mystery lingers, and many hope that someday, with advances in DNA and investigative techniques, the killer will finally be unmasked.